Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. We're at the final two sessions of CISO-X here at the siberXchange. And one of the lessons that I took from the morning and the afternoon exchanges was from that discussion held by Stan Lowe from Zscaler. Stan mentioned something which alerted us as cybersecurity professionals and enthusiasts to our blind spots. The idea being that the only way through a locked front door is through an unlocked window. My name is Ali Hirji. I'm the lead on the siberXchange advisory. I also work at Durham College and teach there as well. You're hearing me live from the beautiful St. Francis studio here in the beautiful town of Ajax. This land belongs to the people of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation and is protected under the Williams Treaties. I want to thank Mayor Sean Collier and his team, and more importantly, the team from siberX, for making these days happen, and more importantly, getting us connected in a very innovative way in the new normal. One of the lessons that I'm going to give you from what I gathered from all of the sessions, besides just Stan Lowe's, was today not only have we changed as individuals, how we appear has changed, but the very mirror that we look into has changed as well. The attack surface when it comes to cybersecurity has changed dramatically. And as you know all too well, the only thing more dangerous than an evil actor is an educated evil actor. The attack surface has not only changed, but those attacking now have more information and more insight to work with. How do you correspond with such change? How do you interrogate such challenge? How do you defend? And how do you secure? How to secure the known and defend the unknown. Joining me today are three individuals who not only have a very good awareness of how to secure and defend the knowns and the unknowns, but also are aware of various contexts in which they've had to work, from public to private sector, large enterprise to small enterprise. Welcome, Daniel Pinsky, Michael Castro, and more importantly, not only do I want to welcome you, but I also want to say that you've come in from various parts of Canada, which takes me to Hugh Burley as well, joining us in from BC. Welcome to CISO-X, and welcome to our discussion on the changing attack surface. I'm going to begin by asking each of you to introduce yourself, but tell me one thing that you've noticed about the nature of attacks post-pandemic. Hugh, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Ali. I'm Hugh Burley. I'm the Director of Information Security at Thompson University, and one of the buildings you can see on the screen behind me there. I'm also the ISO for the Regional Research Network, BCNet. And in terms of what's really changed with the pandemic, I would say the one really obvious one is that the number of credentials that we've seen being misused has increased significantly. So we've seen usually a couple of credential thefts per month, maybe one a week, go up to dozens of credential thefts per month. So that's the first really significant change that I've seen.
And I think that change points to the fact that now actors don't necessarily need to wear their own masks. They're wearing the masks of trusted individuals and stealing identities, and the number of that has gone up. So I really want to come to that aspect of identity and how that has shifted the attack vector. So thank you for that introduction. And I think that ties a lot with the world of education, especially with online education. So we'll work a lot with that. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Michael, we'll go to you. And I really want to hear not only from what you heard from the educational perspective, but I always am fascinated to hear from your perspective how small to medium businesses are being impacted. From your lens, what is the one thing that you've seen from the attack surface that has changed as a result of the pandemic?
Thanks, Ali. So Michael Castro, currently founder and chief security officer for RiskAware, which is a small cybersecurity boutique. But 20 plus years protecting and supporting corporate organizations at various levels with cybersecurity. So I think the one word that I would use right now and what's happening post-pandemic is when it comes to cyber threats is explosive. The the unprecedented level that we're seeing today is nothing like we've seen in a long time.
Yep.
That impact is large, whether it be through the large corporations that I see, and even the small and medium organizations as well. But there's definitely a very large attack vector now we're seeing since COVID that really is prompted by COVID.
I think that word explosive resonates well with a lot of us because the impact and the magnitude of such explosive attacks not only are widespread, but they're instantaneous and they almost hit you unawares, and they're very frequent, detonating at different areas of the enterprise. So we will come to that a little bit more in terms of not just the angle of how long it's taking for these attacks, but how frequently these attacks are now coming up. And we'll go more into understanding that and how you've sort of understood the attack vector some more. Daniel, you work from both the hardware and the software perspective. You work with not only public sector, but also private sector. You're seeing a multitude of things and also an onus of responsibility on your shoulders. From your perspective, please introduce yourself and tell us the one thing that you've seen that has changed about the attack surface post-pandemic.
Thanks, Ali. So Daniel Pinsky from CDW Canada. I serve my organization by running their information security program across the country. I would say that for me, the one thing which has really changed or shifted since the pandemic is the subject matter. And really, I can't say I'm all that surprised. So obviously, because of COVID, it's an unfortunate thing that the whole world is suffering with together, is that phishing is still phishing, ransomware is still ransomware. You have the bad guys still trying to exploit vulnerabilities in a lot of our endpoints and a lot of the technologies that we use. But obviously, they are crafting their messages around COVID-19. Not only COVID-19 in general, but more specifically around the crisis, cure, relief payments, and life after. So they're taking what society has given them, like at one point it was the Olympics, or at another point it was the election. So they're taking what society's given them, and then they are leveraging and they are weaponizing it.
Yep. And I think this aspect of circumstance and knowing how to be not just at the right place at the right time, but have the right tools for the right time, work on both sides. And we're going to go a little bit into some of the tools that are being used and the timing of some of these tools in terms of the attack surface. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. One of the fundamental things that you need to do when you're understanding the attack surface of an organization is you need to visualize it. You need to present it to not just yourself, but those around you. And when you are presenting and visualizing the attack surface, you do it not just with the SOC team, but you also do it with other stakeholders in the organization. Can you talk to us a little bit about how your process of visualizing the attack surface has been impacted as a result of the pandemic? Daniel, we'll start off with you.
I would say for most organizations, and certainly what we've done in our organization, we tend to be very framework focused. So whether your framework of choice is ISO 27001 or NIST CSF or PCI, any of those frameworks, when you go about implementing or adopting them, I would say a prudent first step is doing a risk assessment and then a business impact assessment. And the reason that is part of doing those assessments, it'll give you some level of insight as to what are the assets within your organization, so those primary assets, such as your business processes and activities and information, and then those supporting assets, so hardware, software, network, people, site, and structure. And by really beginning to understand the nature of your organization, what are the objectives of your organization, and how those assets allow your organization to achieve their objectives, then you can really begin to understand and make proper risk decisions in terms of where's the best place to put our very limited amount of resources. So for me, I would say it's about really understanding the risks within your organization.
Yeah, and this decision on once you visualize what the attack surface looks like, especially with how it's shifted. I would imagine that Hugh, in your case, yes, we often talk about moving from the enterprise, so in your case, the beautiful campus behind you, to the various homes, to the various students. But there's more to it, right? Students also live in different locales, different geographies, and they're not just located within a couple of radius of the campus. You have students from other countries, so on and so forth. When you visualize the landscape and you've understood what you're dealing with, I know that most practitioners like to say, don't just show me, tell me, don't just tell me where to go, guide me with where to go. How much do you choose to share, and how much do you keep to yourself? Because there's a lot of panic that's being traded in the market, and you want to sort of stop people from acting from a point of fear. When you visualize the landscape, how do you decide what do I share and what do I not?
Well, it's really the audience that you're addressing that you have to consider when you're sharing information. If you're sharing information with the board or the audit committee of the board, they really don't have time to get into details. They're going to give you perhaps 15 minutes. If you're lucky, you're going to get more than one 15-minute meeting with them a year. So when you share with that group, it has to be very high level. You have to get the message across, and you have to understand what it is that they need to know. So for that group, they need to know what is the level of organizational risk. Are we looking at something that is within our tolerance level, or is it exceeding our tolerance level for risk? They need to know what kind of costing overall the program is going to cost. They need to know what the financial impact is, and they need to understand sort of the broad outlines of what the program is going to incorporate. Beyond that, they may have specific questions driven by media incidents, stuff that makes it into the newspaper. But once again, in that 15 minutes or so that you're going to get with them, you have to stay pretty high level.
Yep.
When you're talking about other audiences, like our information security group at the university, we get into a much deeper level of detail, of course. We're down to the bits and bytes, essentially. What's happening, where are the threats coming from, what are we doing, what technologies are we implementing? So it's a very, very different discussion with that group. And that goes right down to the general awareness of our community members. So
Yep.
when we're talking with them, they need to understand what they specifically need to do in order to participate effectively in our program and to reduce that organizational risk. So really, once again, it's that audience that you're talking to.
Yep. So if I can take that and sort of work with the aspect of audience, right? And you need to know your audience, as that is essential to every communicative practice, and everyone's turning to the CISO or the lead of information security to know more and to hear from you what you're seeing in order to keep the enterprise protected. Michael, if I may ask you, and I've seen you speak on various occasions, and you've thrown numbers, but you've also thrown narrative in there. How do you balance between assessing the threat vectors and the attack landscape from a quantitative and a qualitative landscape? Because it's all good and dandy to say we're seeing these many attacks, but how do you levy that against explaining what the attacks are and going into the qualitative nature of why these attacks are happening? Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. The fact that we're seeing more things now in relation to COVID and the pandemic, it's different, but at the end of the day, it's still the same concept. Organizations, big and small, are being attacked, and that information, that message still needs to be shared and needs to be brought upwards within organizations.
Right.
I've had the opportunity through my many years to speak to many levels of leadership and to boards, both for organizations that I've been part of and those that I am consulting or representing. And you're right, there are definitely messages that can be perceived or can be shared. They're very quantitative in nature, and they're messages that can be qualitative in nature. The problem with quantitative messaging is really it's about numbers, and numbers mean much or can mean a lot to IT or technology folks, but really they do not play always a good message when it comes to sharing that with the layperson or those that really don't understand cybersecurity.
Yep.
So we can give a message of attacks happening to an organization in the tens of thousands, but those can all be mitigated or mooted by an effective firewall policy. And really that attack isn't truly it, and it only takes one email message that can release ransomware within an organization.
Yep.
So instead, the message has to be qualitative.
Fantastic. And I want to just sort of reverse gear a little bit into my sort of nascent forays into the world of cybersecurity, which is kind of very oddly but very fascinatingly married with the world of artificial intelligence, where we've been talking a lot about how do you assess data and how do you make decisions. And there are a lot of automations that are out there and AI-driven technologies that can help you look at signature-based threats and anomalous threats and so on and so forth. But there's a level of human intuition and understanding that goes into understanding these attacks. And I've always maintained this statement when I've been working with my students in AI, and that is this aspect of what's more dangerous than ignorance is false knowledge. And that's simply that illusion that we know what we're talking about and we've understood these attacks. How are you making sure, and Daniel, we'll start off with you, go to Michael and then to Hugh. Daniel, how are you making sure that you are applying the right kind of analysis to the kind of data that you're seeing about these threats? And you are an expert in finding threats proactively, not after they've happened. How are you assessing these and how are you rating the level of risk based on what you're seeing in the pandemic? Daniel?
I would say for us, we have a mature logging and monitoring process in place. So as we monitor for events, those events are then collected, they're normalized, they're correlated. Then we do event identification and event classification. So, we have a fairly robust process in place to ingest those events. And obviously we have very skilled individuals that can look at those events. And to your point, they have a lot of experience and they have a lot of knowledge, and they can make very good conclusions on what those are.
Yeah. And I think drawing the conclusions is one of the fundamental aspects, because those conclusions ultimately allow you to inform decisions and allow you to inform what the next steps are going to be. Michael, I'll take that aspect of drawing conclusions to you and sort of put you in the position of when you are assessing the new threat landscape, so on and so forth. And immediately when you recognize that there is an area where you could be vulnerable, or there is an area where an exploit is likely, what are your immediate next steps now? Because of the fact that we're all remote to a large degree, the immediacy has increased significantly. What do? Do you take the time to further study where you could have a potential breach, or do you immediately go and enact something? The time for sandboxing is over. You need to act much more quicker than previously. What are your steps when you realize that you have an area where you could be vulnerable?
Yeah, the landscape today is so much more difficult than it was 6 months ago. When we had individuals primarily being in a brick and mortar location or being in an office, being on an internal network, it was very much an easier task, not a simple task, but an easier task to be able to figure out what was going on, put in the steps, contact it, literally rip a connection off a machine to be able to stop the impact of it. But that has changed, and that change has really been negatively impacting the ability to respond quickly.
Yeah.
We're looking at attacks, we can see logs, we can generate sources and destinations, but a lot of those have changed, where it's not a simple network ID or network IP that we're seeing anymore. We're seeing connections from home-based networks, from people's personal ISPs that are now being connected on. And that just adds another element to what we have to do. Do we have to act quickly? Absolutely. Should we always be knee-jerking? Not necessarily. But there definitely is a fine balance to be able to find and stop, or at least pause, the attacks that are happening to be able to build enough of an investigation, albeit a quick one, to be able to figure out what to do, and then of course take to the next level, which is how to action that when physically machines and people are not necessarily as easily accessed as they once were.
Yep. And this oscillation between machines and people, it always reminds me of the fact that, at the forefront of our cybersecurity defenses and even our attacks it's people. And you rely a lot on people to provide information. You rely a lot on people to support your efforts, which takes me to Hugh, and that is, Hugh, in such a large enterprise where you are, me being a part of a post-secondary institution as well, you have folks with different academic flavors, different academic tastes, different perspectives. You've got to create a culture in which folks are also reporting to you certain things that they're seeing, because as you've mentioned a lot before, and as my next guest, Abbas Kudrati from Australia, Microsoft, talks about, that if you want to go quick, you go alone. You want to go far, you go together. And you've always held the philosophy of let's go together, working closely with BCNet, working closely with other RANs, making sure that you're sharing information. How have you empowered students, professors, research assistants, principal investigators to share with you what is it that they've been seeing in terms of attacks?
That's a great question, Ali, and one that we've spent a lot of time addressing institutionally. The real question is, how do you get people to take their time to help to identify suspicious activity? Because we're talking about some very smart people on the university campus and lots of young students. But engaging with all those numbers of people is really quite problematic. And we have, of course, run the awareness program. So you try and build a recognition that there is something called information security, and you try and help people identify what process they should follow for certain types of incidents, which is great and helpful. But we get basically an hour a year usually with people in that awareness program. So what we did several years ago is that we moved into what we call a continuous engagement program, where we actually encourage and incentivize people to tell us what's going on, primarily with email.
Yep.
Email is still that giant hole in our network, right? It's where most of the bad stuff is coming in, to be honest. And we now have a very high participation rate. We tell people, don't worry about wasting our time. We want to know. If you think it's suspicious, tell us. And of course, we've put a little bit of automation in there. We've added the send us phishing button to Outlook, and we have continued to engage people after the fact. So one of the things that will kill that engagement is if people think that they're sending something into a bit bucket, it just disappears, there's no response, they don't know what happened. We always respond to people. We always respond to people, tell them what we did and what actions we took. And that sort of continuous engagement, I think, is what's required at every organization these days.
Yep. Hugh, if with your permission, I'd like to sort of stick with you and then go back to Daniel and Michael. And I do apologize if this question starts to dig a little deeper into the sensitivities of some of the work. Often, the folks in IT, the cybersecurity folks, are seen as the omnipotent, the benevolent ones who know it all or know what's going on in the institution. But that's not necessarily the case. And I've always held this belief, because I work a lot with IP, I work a lot with companies where we're developing prototypes, and I've reminded my students all the time that we're very cautious of what's outside and very careless about what's inside, simply because we don't know what's within our perimeters. How have you kept up to speed with what each faculty, each department is doing and using? And I know it comes back to the age-old, shadow IT question, but how are you keeping pace with a dynamic institution with multiple IT practices within the core?
The thing that of course strikes me immediately is, am I keeping pace? Because with thousands and thousands of students and thousands of faculty and staff, you simply can't watch everyone all the time, nor would we want to. So what we have done is we have tried to create standards and policies that help to guide people through the various processes required. And one of those, of course, is, and certainly one that presents a huge risk for every organization, is acquisition of cloud services.
Yep.
Now, in BC, we often say that we're laggards because of the provincial Privacy Act in getting to the cloud, but we still have hundreds of individual cloud services that are in use.
Yep.
So that's really one of the keys, is that we have to have a way to take the time to vet these services and ensure that we are identifying the risk associated with their use, and then allowing that department or faculty to actually make the decision about whether that's an acceptable level of risk. Now, sometimes, of course, that goes further up. If it's a really large risk, it might go up higher in the organization. But usually it's at that divisional or faculty level where it's being decided. Of course, that's only one aspect of that discussion. We also have a lot of monitoring that we do, trying to identify risky behaviors, trying to identify any potential malware on our site. And we have a lot of automation that we have implemented,
Yep.
which often incorporates some artificial intelligence in the back end to help us to deal with that literal tsunami of alerts and threats and
Yep.
that sort of thing.
Yep. And I think that that metaphor of the tsunami of alerts and threats also applies to how many rules and regulations that can we set in place without impeding our business and not having that analysis paralysis moment, which takes me to the Northern Lights, to Daniel. And Daniel, let's work with this a little bit. You are a trusted source for both hardware and software. Folks look at you as sort of the signature holders of everything that's safe to use and well approved to use. How have, in light of the pandemic and knowing the new vectors of attack and the new surface, how has this changed your understanding of hardware procurement and software procurement, or has it at all?
I would say for my current organization, those processes haven't been impacted that much. And I think that's because such large portions of our organization, because we are certified against ISO and NIST, a lot of the rigor that Hugh was mentioning in terms of administrative or procedural controls, technical or logical controls, obviously physical controls, security awareness and training, phishing exercises, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, access control reviews. I can go on and on. A lot of those controls, they're already within our environment. Like, we don't have a choice for them to be there, and maintain this relentless focus day after day, week after week, month after month. From a vendor management or procurement point of view, again, we have a robust vendor management process. We don't have a choice. It's part of those two certifications and the frameworks. So yeah, I would say from that point of view, it hasn't really materially impacted those processes.
I think, Michael, what we're hearing is from Hugh Burley now is to open up the doors of exchange and getting information from as many sources as possible and making it easier for different faculties within a large enterprise to share information. From Daniel, we're hearing about the importance, even more so, of not just following our frameworks, but auditing how we're following our frameworks, which takes me to how has all of this also impacted your way of what constitutes the core skills that you need in a cybersecurity team to face this new attack landscape? And I ask this because in a mix of both this strange cocktail that we have of human intelligence and artificial intelligence, and we're mixing it all together, we're transforming the way we're doing security, but are we transforming enough to keep pace with some of the attacks that are coming our way? What are the skill sets now that you think are key that weren't before in a security team?
So, I mean, there's always that very specific skill set that builds out on what a cybersecurity professional can do. I don't think we'll ever be eliminating that or reducing that need. But you're right, Ali, the merging of AI with or artificial intelligence with the human intelligence has really changed some aspect of the data flow and the information that's coming in, and then how is that handled?
Yep.
The shortages that we still continuously see in increasing, in the cyber field, it's getting tougher and tougher to have that workforce that is exclusively specific to cybersecurity, which has led many leaders to be looking at alternatives to shore up those teams. I think good, strong teams now, even with the banner of cybersecurity and that moniker, come from all fields now. We're looking at data scientists. We're looking at experts in IoT. We're looking at engineers or past engineers, and we're looking, of course, at IT folks.
Yep.
And when we put all those together, we see that large group, because one of the shifts that we're seeing is looking for and needing individuals that are specifically skilled or trained in cyber versus those that have a skill set that can blend into cyber, and then that cyber skill set can be added to what they already provide.
Yep. I think that complements the change that we're seeing in the landscape. But often I've retained this point that when it comes to digital transformation, humans aside, we use all the computer automation. But the sad part being is that much of this automation only gives us answers. Doesn't necessarily, unless we apply our own human thinking, doesn't necessarily give us the questions that we need. Which takes me to a question that I'm going to go back to Daniel, then to Hugh, and then to Michael. And Daniel, from your perspective, if I draw on the discussions that were happening with Fortinet today, with Zscaler, from Jonathan to Stan, there was this aspect of we're seeing even the perpetrators of cyber crimes evolve in their messaging, evolve in their thought process. For example, the Maze group that all of you know about quite well, proliferant in ransomware, specifically against Windows machines, have recently said, hey, for all of our partners who have experienced our product, you now have a discounted rate to get decryption done, for example, right? And suddenly the victims have become partners. And you brought up this note so eloquently, Daniel, around we've created circumstances for attacks, like the Olympics being an example. We've socially constructed the grounds for attacks. What do you think is driving a lot of the attacks that we're seeing now? We have the common drivers, money again, but more than that as well, which is nation-state actors, so on and so forth. Have you seen anything that's changed in how these hackers or how these bad actors are being driven?
In general, no. I think for a second, if I was a bad guy, I'm opportunistic. Yep. So I take what society gives me and I leverage it to my own advantage. So because at the moment, that's what everybody's thinking about, yep. COVID, it's all over the world. They've taken that one topic and they're using it to weaponize, their phishing and their malware and their ransomware. They've just latched on to that one topic because we're all so consumed with it. Yep. So again, I'm not seeing anything different. It's just they're doing what I guess I would do if I were them.
Yep. And that is following the informational breadcrumbs and building the story exactly. and the narrative around it. And again, I've always maintained this is that good cybersecurity practitioners, good technology practitioners are very good Absolutely. Storytellers, and they know how to read these stories. Hugh, I'll come to you, and in an organization where, if you will allow me, we'll narrow in on the students and the panic that sets in, especially if you have an international cohort of students, the panic that sets in that will I be able to complete my semester? Will I be able to qualify for my work permit? Will I be able to apply for that permanent residency? Under the hashtag COVID-19, a lot of information starts getting shared. A lot of things start happening. I'll give you an example. This was about three months ago, and obviously as a result of all of the isolation, different sort of messaging was coming out to try and break us out of the isolation, and different trends were emerging. One of them was on Twitter, which is name the first 5 jobs that you did, hashtag COVID-19, or whatever it is, right, to get people talking. Slowly but surely you realize that those are the very letters with which the story of your life gets revealed to a bad actor. How have you gone down the path of educating students, educating faculty even, around good use of these tools with which we're trying to break our isolation? Hugh?
I wish I had a better story to tell there, Ali. We have a very large student population, about 27,000 students a year, and engaging with that many people in any effective way is an enormous problem.
For sure.
The things that we have done, we have made our internal security awareness program available online so that any student can log into that course and complete that 1 hour, a little over an hour information security awareness session. We do try and get out on campus normally and engage with about 1,200 students a year that way, face to face. Just to get them to take that moment and think about some cybersecurity topic. We also, of course, try and post some content on campus, but not very effective these days. And really, I have to be honest, we're not doing a great job with engaging students on this topic. And I don't know if anybody's doing it better than I am. I hope they are, and they'll tell me how to do it better.
Absolutely, and I would agree with you that there's no recipe of success that we found simply because the tastes and the requirements are constantly changing, and the one size fits all solution is well, for a long time it's been of no value, and it is of no value even now, more so exemplified with the pandemic. But I do want to pick on something that you said and turn to Michael, and that is this aspect about how much do we reveal about our operations. I know, Michael, that you deal with large enterprise, but you also deal with small to medium corporations. And right now, in light of the pandemic, not only because they want to continue to keep their revenue lines open, in the spirit of sharing and openness, companies are now revealing a lot about what they do. For example, we have so-and-so team that's going to be remote, or we have curbside pickup for this and that, and revealing certain things that could not just compromise physical security, but eventually digital security and cybersecurity. Have you seen yourself now guiding companies more and more about their communications and their outward relations and how much they're sharing about their work? Or is that a conversation that you've kind of kept your hands away from simply because there are other things that are hurting our hairlines?
Yeah, we can talk about hurting hairlines for sure. Yeah. The reality is that COVID has really caused organizations to have to change the way they do business. We went through the stages within April where companies were struggling just to be able to stay open, be able to manage their employees, deal with connectivity issues, and still be able to, if they were lucky, have a product or service that they could still sell to the public or to whatever group they had. The reality is that, it seems that no one has a playbook that really meets this, whether it be through an incident response or through business continuity, or even a roadmap on what the company expected to do. I don't think anyone in an organization had a chapter on, hey, let's deal with a pandemic that's going to last months and months and months. Yeah. So organizations are having to do what they have to do. For some of those, that means changing the way they promote, changing the way they sell, changing the way they interact with their clients. And to have security come up in a very quick order to say, no, you cannot do that, that is a huge risk, is something that is very difficult and won't be well accepted by an organization. Because at the end of the day, organizations are in place to, generate results, and whether those results are through income, revenue, or information, whatever it may be. And cybersecurity, which always has been that struggle of marrying, the business requirements to the risk and the security of the company, that marriage has been strained. So I think a lot of cyber professionals are saying, okay, organization, you do what you have to do, but I need to very quickly be able to pivot and be able to take that risk and find a way, whether it be a way that I know or a way that I need to quickly learn to be able to protect that new way that business is now operating.
Yeah, and I think that new way in which we're operating and the amount we disclose, I've said this quite a bit. Our team at the college, we often share what we're doing, and there are various reasons for that. It's about showing opportunity for our community, showing that we're still open for business. But there's also a lot that goes with that. There's identity issues, and people create narratives out of familiarity. And the amount of phishing attacks that have emerged as a result of social media growth is quite unique, and I'm sure we can have a separate discussion altogether on the impact of social media on the attack surface. But I'll pause that narrative there and turn to Daniel with the strength of something that you mentioned around preparedness for a pandemic. Now, my expert vocabulary is very limited, but this notion of pandemic planning, disaster planning, and business continuity has been something that has been common in our vocabulary, and we all succeed in our own arts of how we conduct it. But pandemic planning as a notion, as a practice, I would argue at least, wasn't something that was common in our vocabulary. Now it's going to feature quite a bit. Daniel, from your perspective, how much now is what we've experienced in this pandemic going to influence our future preparations for different attacks and different disasters? Daniel?
So I think it really depends on the organization in question.
Yep.
And I don't think you can make a broad statement that would really cover all types of organizations. Again, I think organizations that are more remote in nature, where they don't have a lot of brick and mortar and their workforce is more transient. Like from a business continuity point of view, whether the threat that we're discussing is a pandemic or something else, it's going to how that organization would respond or prepare or conduct their tabletop exercises is going to be very different from an organization, again, that is more traditional brick and mortar, where other people tend to go to an office every day to conduct their work. From a business continuity, disaster recovery, from a kind of a framework point of view, it's still the same framework. I think that obviously the threats that we're looking at are different. But again, I think a lot of the frameworks out there, the more mature frameworks out there, give you the flexibility that you would need to take into account those different types of threats. Yep.
I think that flexibility and agility is sort of not a choice for a lot of us, especially when we've maintained rigid systems and rigid approaches that have worked for a period of time for us. And Hugh, another sort of a sensitive kind of question, and I'll be perfectly fine if we can't be direct about it. But often we find ourselves screaming about the fire outside while being silent about the smoke within and the smoke on the inside. We like to control access, we like to control identity, but you had mentioned something about credentials, and that ultimately brings me to the question of insider threats. And again, I'm basing this not by targeting one institution or the other, but disgruntled students, staff for that matter, parents as well who are unhappy with the way things are going in relation to their child's future, etc. It can constitute a very significant threat and attack landscape. How are you, I wouldn't ask the question of monitoring, but how are you preparing yourself for that kind of an onslaught? Hugh?
Well, we haven't really seen an onslaught of attacks from inside the organization, and it's not to minimize the significance of that sort of threat.
Yep.
But I think overall, it's a less frequent type of attack, and we do occasionally see them. But we do monitor a lot of activity, a lot of log data flows in each day. We do get alerts on things like brute force attacks. We get alerts on unusual behavior. This individual has accessed thousands of files in a particular location that they normally don't access. Those sorts of things prepare us and allow us to be a bit proactive. But honestly, a really serious insider threat is on the IT side, with those people who actually hold the keys and are the ones that we need to be most concerned about in terms of their rigorous adherence to appropriate behavior. So we do special monitoring of those privileged accounts.
Yep.
And really, that's about it. Honestly, we haven't seen a significant insider threat in the last 10 years.
And just as much as we focus in on the insider situation, we also have to understand the political and the geopolitical and the socioeconomic context of a lot of these threats. I've said this before in other sessions that we began 2020 with Iran and the U.S. Beating war drums. We then went into COVID, but the war drums haven't necessarily dwindle down. Just as of today, for example, there's been some interesting news from the Middle East around relations between Middle Eastern countries and Israel, and lots of different things are happening. How are you, and Michael, we'll start off with you, keeping aware of what's going on globally, and what are some of the key little nuggets of information that you're consistently looking for in order to just adjust your threat level? Are there certain geographies that you're paying attention to? Are there certain issues that you're paying attention to? What's keeping you awake in terms of managing your threat understanding from nation actors specifically?
Yeah, nation states is, nation state activity is one of those very, very large, murky areas that we look at when we think about cybersecurity. We can see attacks from rogue groups, from individuals, from organized crime, and these specific types of attacks be very obvious or you're able to explore it. But the nation states are a little different because the nation states are organizations with a lot of manpower, obviously a lot of money, and very specific outcomes that they're looking to achieve. Now, whether those outcomes are through theft of intellectual property, through information, through disruption, we see it all. So when we look at the landscapes and we see what's happening in current events, we always have to be mindful of what that might mean to us as individual organizations or groups. It's not always obvious. We can see about a launch from North Korea of a new missile, or testing of a new missile, and not really think, well, how would that affect me here at home in Canada, for instance? Yep. But the reality is those can be distractions. Those can be, as you said, beating of the drums that may indicate that certain nations are looking to do something and looking to affect other countries and those individuals and companies within those countries in a negative way. And that negative way may be obvious, it may not be obvious, but the trouble with nation states is they're the hardest to find and the hardest to deal with.
Absolutely, and the hardest to find and the hardest to deal with. I really want to work with that and the communications element in that and the relations with our government partners and come back to Daniel, because Daniel, you're in this situation where you deal with both public and private sector. Have you found yourself at all engaging with municipal or provincial stakeholders around certain aspects around the new threats, or have you been thinking a lot about what our municipal governments and provincial governments could be doing to secure our businesses and to secure our communities against all of these threats that we're seeing? And I ask this specifically in light of the fact that because of how the perimeter has shifted or erased completely and the home has sort of become the seat of the enterprise, it's not often that easy for corporations to govern, and I use that word in air quotes, how you conduct yourselves at home. Is there a role for the government in that? Your perspective, Daniel?
I would say municipally, I don't tend to meet with our municipal governments often. I would say at a federal level, I certainly do. Right. And I do try to stay abreast of, what things are they doing on their end to help protect the country from certain cyber attacks. In terms of our own coworkers and our own customers, obviously we do engage them on a very regular basis, and we do provide them with guidance and advice and what are the things that they could be doing to protect themselves and through that also protect their customers and their employees.
Yep. I want to work with that aspect of customers, and that is simply because without our customers, whether it's in the education sector, small to medium business, whatever we do, they are the source of our revenue. They are the source of what keeps our lights on, so on and so forth. And all we have right now is commitment and an image and a brand image that we maintain in order to keep business going. Which takes me to this aspect of, we just have about 7 or 8 minutes left, about how do we go about reporting, or how are you thinking about if something is to happen, how do you report and talk about it? Yes, under certain guidelines, we are expected to report about a breach or a report about a circumstance within a certain period of time. But have you been thinking through about how reporting has changed in light of the pandemic? Michael, I want to start with you, then go to Daniel, and then back to Hugh. Michael?
So you're right. There are a lot of legal and regulatory jurisdictions, both here in Canada and other countries around the world, where having to report and advising customers and clients of incidents is paramount and at risk of large fines and worse. But the reality is that companies have a responsibility. Yeah. And we look to the early days of security incidents and breaches. And of course, we're not looking even that far ago, where we had the big attacks of organizations such as Target. And we see that a lot of mistakes were made by those early pioneers. They kept things to themselves, they withheld information, they found a way to try to hide the truth in order to minimize the impact and minimize what would happen to that organization. But the reality now is organizations have to realize that attacks are going to happen. And what is separating the good organizations in dealing with breaches and attacks versus the bad ones is how they deal with that information. How quickly they respond, how transparent they are, how remorseful they are for what's happening, and how well they can tell a story of what they're going to do about it. We're still seeing organizations today that we're hearing about events months later than when things happen. Organizations thinking that they have to get all their ducks in a row. We're seeing other organizations where something can happen on a Monday, and by Tuesday morning, that organization is telling their customers and clients and impacted people about what happened and what they're going to do about it. So it's not about being fearful. It's about A, having a good plan, and B, being able to react and action that plan to ensure that everybody is aware and everyone's part of the next steps in that journey to dealing with that breach.
Daniel, breaches or any cybersecurity alarms are sensitive, hypersensitive in light of the pandemic, and hypersensitive even doubly so in the pandemic because of its economic impact on companies. It's for companies especially hurting right now. How do you deal with the aspect of when you're doing reporting on what's happened? How do you deal with blame and ownership? How do you communicate about that? And how do you position yourself in terms of winning back the trust of your stakeholders? Daniel?
Good question. So I certainly agree with what Michael said. In a lot of cases, contractually, there are breach notification clauses or laws that are out there that we have to comply with. To me, this is all about relationships. And if you recall, if you're old enough, I think it was in the 70s or 80s where there was an issue with Tylenol. And the first thing they did is they pulled all of their medication off all the store shelves across the country. So what did that do, right? So something really bad happened. And the first thing they did as an organization is they stepped up, they took the ownership, they were transparent, and they did the right thing. Yep. And by doing that, not only do I firmly believe that didn't harm any sort of the trust or the goodwill that perhaps we built in the brand, I think it's made it stronger. Yep. And I think in this environment, it's all about relationships. Yep. And I think the more that we can take ownership if something really bad happens, but more than that, be upfront about it and telling the victim, quote unquote, what we're going to do about it and not try to hide anything. I think that is the way that we're going to protect trust between ourselves and our clients.
The
So
aspect
I
of
think
yep, go
the
ahead.
idea of keeping things hidden or secret, I think those days are gone.
Yep.
I think those things tend to leak anyhow. So I think it makes more sense to get in front of it and manage the message and also manage the relationship in a more transparent and honest manner.
I would agree, and relationships give us a muscle power that few can imagine. And I think this ties in very well to the introduction that Hugh gave us, where he mentioned that not only is he at the university, but he's also involved with BCNet. And I want to ask you, Hugh, is that from an academic perspective, and at least in the world of the post-secondary education standpoint, you sort of championed a lot of the sharing of intelligence between and security practices between multiple institutions, and sort of formulated BCNet as that nucleus around which you can all gravitate, meet, and share information. How important has it been to have that kind of a culture of sharing with multiple competing institutions, being open and honest with one another about what they're seeing? And how has the exchanges in that consortia changed as a result of the pandemic? Hugh?
Well, I think it's been invaluable, and not only do we have regional, provincial organizations now, we have national organizations as well. In the academic area, we have CUCHO,
Yep.
which is Canadian Council of CIOs, but we also have CCX coming online, and CCCS is also involved in sharing now. So those kinds of sharing organizations have the potential to provide enormous information and allow us to be more proactive, which I think is really important these days. But beyond that, we need to ensure that we start formalizing those sharing agreements. That's something we've been working on both in BC and at the national level with the post-secondary environment. So being able to give assurance and build trust within the community that when you're sharing something, that can be used effectively without creating harm for the sharing organization. And those are kind of the key things, right? We have to be able to build and maintain the trust in order to really evolve that sharing environment.
Thank you. And I want to, recommend to the team at siberX is that this aspect of formalizing what we're sharing and creating a process around it is a topic in and of itself for an entire conference, I would bet, simply because of the processes you have to have in place and some of the agreements and the trust. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that would be very important for our advisory council and something we would like to discuss. We've got another 2 minutes, and I want to go back to something Stan Lowe said at the conclusion of his presentation today. Stan Lowe, the global CISO for Zscaler, shout out to them for sponsoring and supporting this event. He put up a slide in which he said, CISOs, we put the no in innovation. Michael, I want to start off with you. Have you found yourself, as companies are trying desperately to make up for lost revenue, have you found yourself saying no more, or have you found yourself saying no, but here's why? How have you dealt with the new innovative ideas for business that have been brought to your attention?
Hey, I like the no in innovation. That's a good line. The reality is that a CISO has to be a good balancer of being able to say no and being able to say yes, and finding that line in between that doesn't come across as being that disruptor or that stopper, but being part of the solution. A lot of innovations coming online. We have to embrace as CISOs that innovation that's coming, and we have to find a way to be able to make it work. That doesn't mean we should close our eyes and cover our ears and pretend that we don't know when something bad is there. For sure, if there's something horribly wrong with that innovation, or the risk is so high that we cannot look away, then for sure we have to speak out.
Yep.
But we have to be able to embrace. We have to be able to help them find ways to make it work. And it comes down to teamwork. We have to be a part of the team that's going to say, this new innovation is good for this company. We're going to find a way to make sure it's safe. We're going to make sure it's secure, and we'll make sure that it is not the cause of the next security event that comes to this organization.
Thank you so much, Michael. Now, gentlemen, I would have loved to continue this conversation, but we do have other sessions coming up, and we've got less than 60 seconds left to draw us to our conclusion. So I'll ask you, if possible, if you could take or present one word in terms of how you have seen the impact of the pandemic on our cybersecurity experiences and on the attack vectors, what would that one word be? Hugh, I'll start off with you and put your creative film director hat on to see if you can pick that one word.
I'm going to go with resilient.
Thank you. Daniel.
Context.
Lovely. And Michael?
Visibility.
Being resilient, knowing your context, and more importantly, not looking for what you know, but looking for what you do not know. Gentlemen, before I thank you, I want to repeat to our audience that these fine individuals can all be accessed on www.siberXchange.ca. I couldn't get to all of your questions. I was knee-deep in our conversations, but I'm sure if you have any more, you can post them there, and whenever they get a moment, they will definitely respond to you, or you'll definitely be seeing them at other siberXchange.ca events. One of the things that today's session taught me was this aspect of, we often say, oh, when it comes to the pandemic, we're in the same boat, we're in it together. And I think our audience today, or rather our panelists today, have got us to think about the fact that no, we're in the same ocean, but we're not in the same boat. Some are on yachts, some are on rafts, and some are swimming and just trying to stay alive. And we need to be sensitive to those things, and we need to understand that the attack vectors, everybody's experiencing it differently. And that difference and coming together is what will help us fortify our postures, and more importantly, allow us to engage with one another in the right frameworks. I think there's a lot of strength in numbers, and as they say, the people united can never be defeated. This was a great example of that. So Hugh, Daniel, Michael, as always, a pleasure, and I hope to see you at our next advisory meeting and our next CyberExchange.ca events. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.